Hello? Oh my god, okay, I'm just trying to check if this works. Please work. Hi, I hope it's in focus right now. Oh, I got a new camera and I really like it. It's just, I don't know how to use it. So I wanted to talk about some stuff again today. I'm back, okay? I'm back for now. I came up with this new video idea and I hope you guys like it. Follow me on Instagram, and thank you everyone for your comments in the last video. Yeah, I like these videos where we just hang out and like talk about stuff, but I want to talk about history. Oh, and I have a cold. Yeah, that's why I sound like this. I have a cold. I wanted to do a history video again. Remember I did the Oka crisis video? I wanted to do another video about the pass system. So I was gonna do like a story, because this involves the story of when I went to school, when I was in university, but that story is kind of short. So and the story has to do with Indigenous history. So I thought I would tell the story and then I would go into the history of what I'm talking about, and that is the pass system. So I don't know if you guys know what the pass system is, but it has to do with the Canadian government not allowing First Nations people to leave the reserve, and they had to stay there and they weren't allowed to leave. So I'm gonna talk about that, the history of that. But first, I'm gonna start off with my story. My story is from when I was in university. I was in this class, it was like a sociology class. Sociology is like basically the study of society, and that's what I was doing. I think we were talking about different societies all around the world, but then my instructor, he ended up talking about First Nations people. One of his slides during his lecture had to do with First Nations people. It had to do with them migrating to urban areas. So basically, he presented this slide as a question and like an interesting phenomena that happened in society. He said, after the 1950s, First Nations people began rapidly migrating to urban areas. Like, he presented it like this big question, like what could have caused this sudden migration of First Nations people in the 1950s to urban areas. I thought he was gonna like start talking about the past system and go into the history of Canada and like First Nations people, but he didn't know, like he was actually asking that question. And of course I knew the answer because I was an Indigenous Studies major, so I knew the history and I knew it was because of the past system. I decided to put my hand up in class, and you know me, I'm shy, but I decided to put my hand up because there was no one else who was Indigenous in my class, so no one else really knew. And then so I was like, well, I know, I can talk about it. So I put my hand up. He was like, yes. I was like, well, First Nations people moved to urban areas after the 1950s because of the pass system. And the pass system was basically that First Nations people weren't allowed to leave their reserve until like the mid 1900s. I just told him that. I was like, there's this thing called the pass system, and that's why a bunch of First Nations people started moving to urban areas after the 1950s. So I told him that, and then he was like, I don't know. I don't know about that one. I'm gonna have to look more into that. And then, yeah, he said he would have to look more into it to see if, like, that was correct. But I knew it was correct. After he shot me down, after I gave my answer in front of the class, I didn't feel discouraged because I knew I was right. And like, I was just kind of thinking like, that's kind of not right of him to be like, not believing me and what I have to say. Like, as someone who's like teaching in like a higher place of learning, I don't know, it was just kind of embarrassing on his part for like not knowing, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, like, I didn't feel discouraged because like I knew I was right and I knew he was wrong.
Listen, you little wiseacre. I'm smart, you're dumb. I'm big, you're little. I'm right, you're wrong. And there's nothing you can do about it.
Like, yeah, that's it. I just wasn't discouraged because I knew I was fucking right. That's basically what happened. Like, nothing really happened after that. I didn't say anything. I didn't get too mad. I was just like, whatever. He doesn't believe me, that's fine. He can go look it up then. And then he'll realize I was right. I think that was kind of ridiculous, and that's just something that happened to me in university where someone kind of made it seem like I was wrong about my own history, and I'm not wrong. And that's why I'm here to make this video, because I'm gonna tell y'all about what happened with the pass system. I have some notes here. I wrote some notes. Like I said to my instructor, First Nations people started migrating after the pass system like was no longer a thing, which happened in the 1940s, 1930s and 40s, and then after that is when First Nations people could start moving to urban areas. Basically what the pass system was it was like an assimilation tactic that was created by the Canadian government to like control First Nations people. If you don't know what assimilation is basically something that the government wanted to do. They basically wanted to get rid of all First Nations and Indigenous people in Canada. Like, we were kind of the problem, and we were what was stopping them from creating Canada, and making it a country and like going forward with capitalism, basically creating what we live in today. We were what was stopping them, and we were the problem, so they kind of wanted to like kill us off, and that didn't work. They weren't able to like literally kill us and wipe us out. So the next best option was to assimilate us, which means they want us to basically become settlers. So they want us to act like settlers and eventually transition into being just like them instead of being like native people. And even though they wanted to wipe us all out, they couldn't do that. They did not succeed in doing that. So the next best thing was to assimilate us and try to make us like them. So like turning us into Christians, making us dress like them, making us work jobs like them, live in society, not live off the land, live in houses, not in teepees and all the other types of housing. I mean, not housing, all the other types of shelter and way of life that First Nations people used to live before settler contact. They wanted to get rid of that and like just make us like them. That's basically what assimilation is. So this was kind of part of that, their attempt to assimilate us. It was basically created so that it could prevent First Nations people from moving around as well as gathering together. They didn't want First Nations or any Indigenous people at all to gather and congregate. They didn't want First Nations people to like plot against the government and like try to resist what the government was doing, because the government was trying to assimilate us and wipe us out, like I was saying. And First Nations people and other Indigenous groups, they obviously weren't going to go down without a fight. There was a fight, and then this fight is the reason that the pass system was created. This fight was known as the Northwest Resistance or the Northwest Rebellion. And this was like a big, huge series of battles where Indigenous people resisted against the Canadian government and the settlers. Yeah, a lot of people died in this rebellion or this resistance, and it was pretty scary for the settlers and the like new developing Canadian government. Oh yeah, by the way, this all started in 1885. So the pass system was in place from 1885 to 1940. The pass system all started because of the Northwest Resistance, like I was just saying. And the Northwest Resistance happened because the government was just like harassing the indigenous people, as always. The Northwest Resistance happened in 1885, but there was a lot of other things that happened before 1885 that kind of led up to this, but I'm not gonna go into that because that would be too complicated to explain. Yeah, it all had to do with like the government just really trying to push indigenous people around. And when I say indigenous, I mean like Métis people, and First Nations, different First Nations groups like Cree people. So the Northwest Resistance was a fight, a battle, a series of battles between Métis people and English settlers. And then the Cree people were allies to the Métis people, so they helped fight with them. The kind of start of it happened in Manitoba, which is where like Métis people originate from, like the Red River Métis people. And I don't know if you don't know what Métis is. Métis is basically, it's a distinct type of people, which is like it's part First Nation and then part Hi everyone, so I'm editing this video right now, and when I was recording I was having a hard time explaining who the Métis people are, so I found this video and it explains it much better, so I'm gonna show it, so watch this.
The Métis are people in Canada who can trace their origins from mixing of First Nations people with European settlers. They were the children born to European men and their indigenous wives. When the fur trade moved west in the 1700s and 1800s, many French-Canadian fur traders found native wives and had children. The children born from these unions formed the new nation in Canada called the Western Métis. There were few European women in fur trade, and most fur traders married indigenous or mixed-blooded women for practical reasons. An indigenous woman could set up camp, dress furs, make leathers and clothing, cook meals, gather firewood, make moccasins, net snowshoes, and many other things essential to daily life for the fur traders. And when they bore children, they were called Métis children.
So the Métis people were part of the Northwest Rebellion, and the Northwest Rebellion kind of started in Manitoba. Like I said, they originated in Manitoba, in the Red River area. I'll show you a picture of Manitoba and then the Red River, which is like kind of where I live. So yeah, they had land here for generations and generations. So like they had their own towns established and like their own farms and stuff that like they lived on for generations. And then English settlers came here, and then they started like pushing the Métis out of their homeland that they were on for generations, because they wanted that land. The English settlers wanted that land. So the Métis people started like experiencing a lot of racism, discrimination, violence, and things like that. Which were like attempts at the English to get them away from this land so that they could have it. And they actually succeeded. A lot of the Métis people decided to leave. Like that had to have been heartbreaking, to leave the land that you like actually grew up on, that like your parents and grandparents and everyone else like in your family grew up on, having to leave that because of discrimination. It was really bad for the Métis people, so they had to leave. They decided to go to the next province over in Saskatchewan. So they found a place to go in Saskatchewan, and they kind of started like creating their own home there for themselves. They started like creating their farms and establishing a home again in Saskatchewan. And then guess what? the English settlers continued moving towards Saskatchewan, and they found the Métis people, and they tried to do it again. They tried to push the Métis people out again, and the Métis people this time were like, nope, sorry, fuck that, you're not pushing us out, we're not doing this again. This time we're gonna put up a fight, and y'all are not gonna be doing this again. So yeah, that's basically what the Métis people decided. Like, they weren't gonna let the English settlers push them out of this place now after they just took their home. They're not gonna take the new place that they're trying to build a new home on. They decided they were gonna put up a fight against the English settlers, and the English settlers were gonna fight back. So one of the main guys who was leading this fight against the English settlers was a guy named Gabriel Dumont.
The powerful Métis leader, Gabriel Dumont, has been looking for ways to put pressure on the government.
He was like, no, we're not letting you people do this time. We're gonna fight. And that's what they did. But Gabriel Dumont wanted help from this guy named Louis Riel.
Then Dumont explained, I want to tell you there's one man who can do what I want to do, and that's Louis Riel.
If you're from Canada, you probably know who Louis Riel is, or you've probably heard of him. We have a day called Louis Riel Day in Canada. But anyways, yeah, Louis Riel was part of this rebellion, and Gabriel Dumont wanted his help. And Louis Riel, well, in the 1870s, Louis Riel was one of the main Métis political leaders. So he was like connecting with the government and like talking to them on behalf of the Métis people in the 1870s. But then he killed this guy named Thomas Scott in 1870, and then he was about to go on trial for that, and he didn't want to because he probably would have got like killed. So he fled to the United States, and he went to go hide down there for 15 years until 1885 when the rebellion happened. And Gabriel Dumont wanted his help, so he went to go find Louis Riel in the United States, and he was like,
hey, I want your help. These English people are trying to kick us out, and I could really use your help.
So Louis Riel agreed to go help Gabriel Dumont with stopping the English people from taking their new home. Louis Riel helped Gabriel Dumont stand up to the British. So, like I said, this battle also included Cree people. The Cree people were also involved, and they were helping the Métis fight against the British settlers as well as the Canadian government, because the Cree people also had their own beef with these settlers. Basically what was happening was the Cree people wanted to resist as well and help the Métis, because the government was like starving the Cree people and they were like preventing them from eating. They wanted First Nations people to sign these treaties because they wanted to build a railway to the western part of Canada because of colonization. The First Nations people were living on the land where they wanted to build the railway, and they needed to get them out of the way so they can build the freaking railway. So their way to do this was have them sign treaties, and they would be like, hey, if you sign this treaty, I'll give you this plot of land up here away from my railway. That way I can build my railway and then you can go live up here. Does that sound like a deal? So basically that's what they were trying to do to the Cree people. And then the Cree people, well, the Cree chief, Big Bear, I don't know if you guys have heard of him. Big Bear, he was a Cree chief. He wanted to negotiate more with the government and make a better deal with the government for his people. He wanted more than what they were offering him, but they didn't want to offer him more. Big Bear didn't want to sign that treaty. He was like, nope, sorry, not doing that. The government really wanted him to sign the treaty. They were like, how can we get him to sign the treaty? And then what they came up with was that they were going to starve Big Bear and his people. They were going to starve the Cree people. How they were going to do this was, there was these things back then called rations, And the government kind of gave First Nations people food. They weren't giving Big Bear the rations for his people. So basically how they decided to starve the Cree people, Big Bear's people, was that they were going to kill all of the buffalo in the prairies in the area, so that they couldn't hunt buffalo anymore, and like they couldn't feed themselves and provide for themselves.
The thing we had to have, we businessmen with rifles, was one-shot kills. We based our success on the overwhelming stupidity of the buffalo. Unquestionably the stupidest game animal in the world.
Up and down the plains those men ranged. Behind them came the skinners with their wagons. They piled the hides and bones into the wagons until they were full, and then took their loads to the new railroad stations to be shipped east to market. Sometimes there would be a pile of bones as high as a man, stretching a mile along the railroad track.
32 million pounds of buffalo bones made their way from the plains to eastern factories. Perhaps as many as 3 million buffalo killed.
Where there were myriads of buffalo the year before, there were now myriads of carcasses.
So the settlers started killing all the buffaloes for no reason. Like, there was lots of buffalo who died. I will show you a picture. They wasted all these buffalo just so that the First Nations people couldn't eat them, so that like they would starve and be forced to kind of rely on the government, because the government was going to provide these things called rations as part of the treaty. And what rations were was the government would give them food. Big Bear was kind of like, we don't need rations, we don't need to sign the treaty because we can just hunt buffalo and feed ourselves, like what the heck. And then so the government started like killing all the buffalo so that they could no longer feed themselves, so that they would need the rations. They were starving because they didn't have any more buffalo. There was no more buffalo in the prairies. The settlers killed them all, and they couldn't feed themselves anymore. They really were starving. Like, obviously Big Bear didn't want his people to starve. So that was like his reason for wanting to resist the government, because the government was starving his people just so he could sign the treaty. So Big Bear was like, yes, I'm gonna help Louis Riel and the Métis people resist the government, because I don't like what they're doing to me. I don't like what these settlers are doing. But Big Bear wasn't he wasn't this violent man who wanted to like kill all the settlers. He just wanted better for his people, okay? He didn't want to murder all the settlers. He just wanted better things for his people. He didn't want them to starve, but he also didn't want the no good deal that the government was trying to do with the treaties. But the government wasn't having it. They were like, no, this is what you get, and that's what you get. We're not changing it. Yeah, that's the reason why Big Bear wanted to resist. So anyways, there was like a whole bunch of series of battles within this with the Métis and Cree people resisting. There was other First Nations people involved, but I'm mostly just gonna talk about Big Bear. One of the big battles in this resistance was the massacre at Frog Lake. And kind of what happened at Frog Lake was... Hi, editing me again. So I got this wrong in the video, my information about the Frog Lake massacre, which I don't know, it's not really called massacre anymore. And I got the thing wrong in the video when I was doing my makeup, because there are like a lot of different stories about what actually happened with the Frog Lake massacre. It's kind of the same story, but there's like different little details in different stories or different things that I'm reading online. And basically what kind of happened was Big Bear's people were starving, and the Indian agent was starving them, and there was tension between Big Bear's people because they were starving, and like everyone wanted to do different things to like solve this problem. And there was this person, his name was Wandering Spirit, and he was part of Big Bear's band, and he wanted to just go demand food from the Indian agent, and he wanted just to go get food because they were all starving. And then they went there, and there was like some kind of altercation between the Indian agent and Wandering Spirit. The Indian agent's name was Thomas Quinn, and 9 settlers ended up dying in this altercation. And that's kind of where things like, there's like different stories about that part, because like there's one here where it said that Wandering Spirit wanted to take Thomas Quinn, the Indian agent, as hostage, and he wanted to take him as a prisoner and move him to a different location, and just keep him because he treated the Crees really badly and he was starving them. So, and then Thomas Quinn refused to go, and Wandering Spirit shot him in the head, apparently. That's one thing that I read. And then there's another one here where it said that Wandering Spirit just went to the Indian agent's house and demanded food, and then he said no, and the Indian agent Thomas Quinn said no, and then Wandering Spirit just shot him because he said no. Which I don't know, it could have happened, but I'm leaning not towards that one. So there's just different things that I heard, but then I also found this video. I'm gonna show it. It's by this guy, and his name is Sean Waskahat, and it's at the Frog Lake National Historic Site, and he's just speaking to these kids about what happened and like what the oral story is about from his community. This is what he says happened anyways. Well, it's interesting. I found it interesting, so I think you should watch it.
Yes, these are all markers of a very important part of what happened here in 1885. How many years ago? Who's good at math? 1885. 136 years. We have grandfathers that kept this story alive for us, and I'm going to share with you today just a little part of what happened. This is a rich part of Canada. We have lakes all over here. This is where we grew up. This is a part of our land, and as they started taking it away from us, it got closer. So this is where we ended up, on the shores of Frog Lake. So that day, that fateful day in 1885, there was this young woman. Her name was, I don't know what her name was. You guys must have heard of Big Bear before, right? Big Bear? Everybody heard of Big Bear? So in his camp was a chief named Wandering Spirit. They got sent here to Frog Lake. And in Frog Lake, there was an Indian agent who was doing bad things. You can see the markers are marked here. The young lady went missing for 3 days, and there was a war chief that took it upon himself to go look for her. So they went there the first day. The Indian agent said, no, she's not here. The second day they went back. Again, the Indian agent said, no, she's not here. But everybody in the camp knew that was the last place they went. So as the Indian agent went there the third day, didn't bother asking the Indian agent. Unfortunately, he lost his life that day. His name was Thomas Quinn. You can look about it on YouTube. He was one of the first guys to get shot that day. And as he got shot, there was a camp. The store was full of goods and blankets. The women and children, they went in there to get what they needed because they were starving. The Indian agent wouldn't give them nothing for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, weeks. There were children dying here. So when Wandering Spirit did that, he didn't do it out of anger. He did it out of love for his people. And it was one of the bravest things that could ever be done, is to sacrifice your own life, because he knew what was going to happen if he killed the Indian agent. So as they were fleeing up the hill with their goods, the rest of these people, they were trying to gun them down, the women and children that were running up the hill. So it wasn't like they went in there and just started killing everybody. No, it wasn't like that at all. We were defending ourselves. And it was a part of history, a part that you need to know.
That was one of the main fights within the Northwest Rebellion. There were like a bunch of other fights within it. Basically, the Northwest Rebellion was like this huge series of battles between the Cree people and the Métis people, and then they were fighting against the English settlers and the government. I can't go into every single battle, I'm sorry you guys. Like, the video is supposed to be about the pass system, but a huge part of the pass system has to do with this resistance, and it's a long resistance. Like, it's very long, and there's a lot of things that happened, a lot of different battles. The final battle happened in this place called Batoche in Saskatchewan. The Métis and the settlers, as well as the Northwest Mounted Police, aka the RCMP, they're known as the RCMP today, you know, the federal police, the bad guys, yeah, them, just kidding. Hi, so I look really rough right now, my bad. I'm just finishing up editing this video and I made a little mistake for the millionth time. It wasn't only the Northwest Mounted Police who went in to stop Louis Riel and the Métis, and yeah, it was also the Canadian Army, the troops. There was like 500 soldiers who got sent to go get Louis Riel too in Batoche. The soldiers were led by, his name was Frederick Middleton. Him, as well as the RCMP. They were fighting against the Métis people, and they eventually like got the Métis people cornered in this church, and the Métis people, like, they had no more ammo, they weren't able to fight anymore, so Louis Riel had to give up, and he waved this white flag outside the church, and yeah, he eventually got taken, he got arrested, put on trial, he was hanged. Big Bear, he got arrested and tried and charged with treason and felony, but he wasn't hanged. He was sentenced to 3 years in Stony Mountain Penitentiary, which is in Manitoba. And it's still there. I'm pretty sure it's not the same one that Stony Mountain was at. I mean, that Big Bear was at, but like Stony Mountain Penitentiary is in Manitoba. That's where Big Bear went because of like the whole thing with Frog Lake and his people doing the massacre thing and killing 9 settlers. And then there was also this other chief. I didn't mention him in this whole video, but his name was Poundmaker, and Big Bear and Poundmaker were both really peaceful chiefs, and they didn't believe in violence and rebelling and all that, but like they needed to resist. But Poundmaker was more the type of person that kind of believed you could talk it out and eventually negotiate, because he was a really good talker. That's what he was known for. And Poundmaker and Big Bear were actually really peaceful chiefs, and they wanted to negotiate, but then Big Bear's people wanted to fight. Part of Poundmaker's band too, part of his people also participated in like some of the resistance and the killings and things like that. So that's why Big Bear and Poundmaker ended up getting sentenced to do time in Stony Mountain Penitentiary, not because of what they did, but because of what members of their bands did. I just wanted to clarify that. This big whole event, the rebellion, is why the pass system was created, because the government and the settlers, they wanted to prevent First Nations and all Indigenous people, including Métis people, from gathering and resisting the government again. So basically, there was this guy, his name was Hater. His name was Hayter Reed. He was the assistant commissioner of Indian Affairs, and he was like a few people under the prime minister when it came to Indian affairs. So he came up with this memorandum, and he sent it to like all the people who were like involved with Indian affairs. Part of this memo was the pass system, and he came up with this idea that like we're gonna get the First Nations people to live on their reserves, and we're not gonna let them leave unless they get a pass from the Indian agent, who is the person who watches the reserves. And then we're also gonna have like the RCMP, or the Northwest Mountain Police. They were gonna enforce it. The Indian agent is the person who would issue the passes. The Indian agent would like give permission for them to leave. It would say where they're going, how long they're going for, when they're gonna come back. It needed to be signed, and yeah. The guy Hayter Reed, he came up with this memo, and like he sent it around, and then it didn't even get to John A. Macdonald for John A. Macdonald to approve. He just started enforcing it on his own. He made that executive decision that the First Nations people weren't allowed to leave their reserves. But eventually, like a few months later, it did get to John A. Macdonald, and he did start like endorsing it. It never actually became law. Like it was just something like an unwritten rule that First Nations people weren't allowed to leave their reserves, and the Northwest Mounted Police, as well as the government and like the Indian agent, they all enforced this. If someone got caught without a pass, they would be arrested and taken back to the reserve. The pass system had a bunch of negative effects on all First Nations people. It prevented them from like gathering to do ceremonies. Another thing is that it broke family connections. So like if you had a cousin who lived on another reserve, you couldn't go visit them. Like they basically no longer existed anymore. You couldn't talk to them anymore. Another thing is that like it broke the Indigenous or the First Nations economy, because the First Nations people would like go sell things at markets, like produce, and then they would take it to sell at markets. But then like if the Indian agent said no, or if the Indian agent would take too long to give them a pass, their produce would go bad, so they couldn't make money, and then they would have to depend on the freaking rations that the government would sometimes decide to give and sometimes decide not to give, or sometimes decide to give it when it's already old and moldy. Like this is how First Nations people were being treated after they signed the treaties. And that was like a big reason why Big Bear did not want to sign the treaties. He knew that the treaties meant that it would cause First Nations people to go into poverty, and like basically it would make them depend on the government, and the government is like not dependable or reliable. We were kind of forced to depend on them for like rations and food and like gardening supplies and land, and like literally forced into signing these treaties with the government. And then the government was like, oh, this is what you're gonna depend on us for, but we're actually not gonna give it to you, or we're gonna give it to you in the worst way ever. We're gonna give you moldy rations, we're gonna give you broken gardening tools, we're gonna give you this crappy land that's very hard to survive on. And like that's too bad, because now you need us because you signed these treaties. They made us depend on them, and they're not dependable. And like that's kind of what Big Bear saw. He was like, no, this is not good for the people, and I don't want to sign the treaties because this is not going to be a successful future for my people. And then after the resistance, he sent to Stony Mountain, and then he got released. Actually, Big Bear got released because his health was deteriorating in Stony Mountain, so they released him, and then he died in 1988. And then Louis Riel went on trial for his part in the rebellion or the resistance, and for basically leading the resistance and leading the Métis people to fight against the government and the settlers. And he ended up going to trial and being sentenced to death, and he got hanged. And yeah, they didn't want that to ever happen again. So they developed the pass system. No more congregating, no more gathering, no more plotting against the government. Y'all have to stay in your reserve and depend on us. That's basically the whole history of what I was trying to tell my teacher. That's basically why the pass system was created, to stop First Nations people from moving freely and gathering. And the government did a really good job of doing things in the past to ensure that our future is not a bright future as First Nations people. But the government did a really good job of bringing us down and kind of almost destroying us and destroying our way of life and who we are as people with all their assimilation tactics. Like, thinking about this history is just really showing me that, like, it was a really good plan on Canada's part to, like, break down First Nations people, and it really worked. And this is like what they wanted for First Nations people to suffer and live in poverty and like have all these social issues that we do live with today. I don't know, that's just the history, y'all. I'm just telling it, and I'm not a fan of Canada. And this is, if I got any details wrong, or if you guys, like, if I skipped over something that you think that's really important part of this story, feel free to let me know in the comments, because I would love to hear things that you know about this history. If, like, I missed something that's important in this story, feel free to correct me, honestly, because I'm not totally right. Thanks for watching. I really hope I did this video good. I don't know. Bye.